Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Sorry, I apologize for interrupting the conversation. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Becca Pincus, and with my colleagues at the Wilson Center, along with the Department of Energy, the University of Alaska, and RAND, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event on critical minerals in the North American Arctic. If anyone is not familiar with the Wilson Center, we are a think tank mandated by the U.S. Congress to bridge policy, practice, and research. Established as a living memorial to President Wilson in 1968, the center is today home to 17 regional and topical programs. These include the Environmental Change and Security Program, the WABA Institute for Strategic Competition, and the Canada Institute, who are partnering with us on today's event. The program I direct, the Polar Institute, works to advance polar policy through dialogue and programming like this. Together, our programs leverage our global networks and our topical regional expertise to drive new conversations and collective action on critical minerals. Our work recognizes that critical minerals policy is foreign policy. That is why we are so delighted to be partnering today with DOE, UA, and RAND. I want to especially thank Erin Whitney, Pat Pitney, and Abby Tingstad. Dr. Whitney is an important leader in the federal government on these issues in the Arctic Energy Office at DOE. Pat, the president of the University of Alaska, has decades of experience advocating for Alaskans and building the state's capacity to grow. Abby Tingstad is a thought leader at RAND and is influencing discussions across this space. This conference is a follow-up to a conference on critical minerals held in Fairbanks last year, hosted by the University of Alaska, the Arctic Research Commission, and the Polar Institute. I want to thank Pat Pitney and Mike Safraga for their vision in initiating this conversation and for enabling us to carry their work forward this week here in DC. We have a strong team from Alaska here, and I want to thank everyone from the north who traveled a long way to a hot place. We are grateful for the gift of your time. I want to thank Jack Durkee, who has been with the Polar Institute from the start. Most of you know him as the behind-the-scenes hero who actually makes everything at the Polar Institute happen. But today he deserves the spotlight. This creative, thoughtful agenda is his doing, and he has led the planning and execution of this event. While any flaws or problems this week are on me, he deserves the credit for any success. I know you'll be seeing more of him in the future. And a final thanks to Wilson Center CEO Mark Green, who has been watching this issue and who challenged us to develop an event that would move the needle, in his words, on policy around critical minerals. We're grateful for his leadership and support. You all already know that global demand for critical minerals is skyrocketing and that the People's Republic of China controls most mining and processing of these strategic materials. US-Canada Greenland cooperation on sustainable development of critical minerals is needed to close this critical vulnerability and enable the green transition. While the concerns around environmental and social impact of mining and processing must be met squarely, the long history of community-led mining in Alaska and Canada offers lessons that can be applied to new efforts around critical minerals. These three areas also share common challenges, including scarce infrastructure and historic underinvestment. A North American approach to critical minerals can leverage the strong community bonds, the shared geography, and the unbeatable security offered by proximity to address one of the most pressing strategic vulnerabilities confronting the United States and its allies. Please join me now in welcoming Pat Pitney, the 17th president of the University of Alaska System. Pat has a long and distinguished career in Alaska, both in state government and at the university. She's a former Olympic gold medalist and a great friend of the Polar Institute. Thank you, and welcome, President Pitney.
Somehow that never gets forgotten. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to everyone who's joined for this important two-day dialogue about the future of critical minerals development in the Arctic. It's very exciting to be here as a follow-up to Alaska's Minerals, a Strategic National Imperative Summit that we hosted last summer in Fairbanks. One of the conclusions of that summit was to have a follow-up here in DC that was more policy and action-oriented. We have to have recommendations and policies to take advantage of Alaska's tremendous critical mineral wealth for the nation's economic and national security. Today, I appreciate all of you being here to do just that. We all know that critical minerals are essential to the production of renewable energy, vital to national security, innovative technologies, and so much more. While our conversation over the next 2 days will focus on critical minerals, the reality is we will be discussing how the United States can maintain its global power. Unless the United States can expand access to critical minerals, rare earth elements, and basic metals like copper, we risk jeopardizing our global leadership, our economic prosperity, and national security. Rather than continuing or increasing our dependence on foreign sources, I strongly believe we need to focus on the abundance of critical minerals and metals found in the United States, including and emphasizing Alaska, the state that makes the United States an Arctic nation. I want to welcome our Arctic allies from Canada and Greenland and Iceland who have joined us today for these conversations. Their natural resources are also important to our collective progress. According to the Alaska Division of Geological and Geophysical Survey, we have nearly 50 of the critical minerals identified as important by the U.S. Department of Defense and Geological Survey right in Alaska. A study from the Institute of Social and Economic Research at the University of Alaska Anchorage found that Alaska is uniquely positioned to lead the production of graphite and cobalt. Alaska has the potential to single-handedly produce more graphite than is produced in the entire country today. Alaska has the potential to double the domestic production of cobalt. These are just 2 of nearly 50 critical minerals in Alaska. More than potential, though, we have the imperative. Much like the national imperative to build the Trans-Alaska Pipeline during the oil embargoes nearly 50 years ago, and the construction of the Alaska Highway 80 years ago, when we were facing security issues with World War II. Our nation has an overwhelming need, and Alaska has the location and resources to meet that need. The nation's defense, its economic independence, and its ability to meet clean energy goals and climate goals are dependent on expanding responsible mining that Alaska has demonstrated for decades. Through responsible and environmentally friendly mining, Alaska can fuel the United States' needs. Accessing Alaska's resources is key to the transition of clean energy, advanced technologies, and national security. Support from DC and the federal agencies, though, are essential. Alaska's statehood was predicated on the fact that it is rich in natural resources, and developing those resources is in our nation's interest and the only path to a viable state economy. Early in Alaska's statehood, Alaska's indigenous peoples were recognized with substantial land grants and the establishment of the Alaska Native Corporations. Additionally, there are 231 recognized tribes in Alaska. The support, inclusion, and leadership among Alaska Native corporations has been instrumental in Alaska's resource development to date and will be critical in the future. We appreciate both Nana and Doyon's participation here today. Thank you for being here. The dialogue we engage in over the course of the next 2 days will focus on key challenges to developing Alaska's critical minerals such as ownership, financing, infrastructure, regulatory frameworks, research, and workforce development. As president of the University of Alaska System, you may wonder why I'm serious about this agenda. University of Alaska has strengths in Arctic research, climate change, remote sensing, renewable energy, Arctic infrastructure. On the workforce side, University of Alaska Fairbanks operates one of fewer than 15 mining engineering programs in the nation, and an underground mine for workforce training. As the public university system in our resource-abundant state, our job is to support a robust state economy while providing the nation Arctic expertise necessary to mine responsibly. All of us here today will help chart that path for the United States to ensure economic prosperity and national security. So thank you all for taking the time, for being here. And before we dive in, I'd like to recognize and thank the team that sponsored this event. I know Rebecca did it as well, but the Wilson Center, thanks Rebecca. Department of Energy's Arctic Energy Office, the RAND Corporation, and special thanks to Jack for doing the planning and organizing and logistics for this event. So now we can start our real work. We're going to start with our first panel, the clean energy transition in the United States, moderated by my good friend, Dr. Mike Schwega.
We'll do this now? Yeah. Okay. Well, it seems we started out very formal, informal. Let me do the following. Thank you again, all of those who have come from far away. Thank you to all of our partners and sponsors. Thanks to the Center for once again holding an important discussion about the future of the North. But as Becca pointed out, it's just highlighted the fact that the Arctic is no longer that place far removed. We are part of every discussion. If nothing else highlights that, perhaps critical minerals, but if you're following the news and watching what's happening at the NATO conference or climate conferences, pick the issue. The North now is not on the periphery. We're in core conversations as we should be. So with that, this first panel is designed to be a core part of the next 2 days. So we've asked 3 colleagues to join us to think about what the 2 days can bring us, to challenge us, to give us their perspectives, and for us to carry their themes throughout the next 2 days. Of course, you'll bring your own expertise and your own considerations, but we thought we'd have a scene-setter discussion that would not only set the tone for the panels, but when we go into work sessions and work with our colleagues from RAND, you'll have the benefit of their inputs and their perspectives since they are experts in their areas. With that, let's get from a formal podium to a less formal panel. And let me come over here and I'll introduce our panelists. And since Duncan Wood is already moving to the this is one of those self things. You have to put your plaque up.
Love it.
You arrange your water. You can vacuum it if you like. So on my left, joining me is Dr. Duncan Wood. He's the Vice President for Strategy and New Initiatives at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'll give you a little bit more about Duncan in a moment when we talk about the different perspectives that he will bring to the conversation. And to my far left is Dr. Erin Whitney, the Director of the Arctic Energy Office at the U.S. Department of Energy. Dr. Emily Holland is not here. She's likes flying so much, she's on the tarmac here waiting for a gate to open up so their plane can get to the gate and she can come here. So when she gets here, I will introduce her and we will embarrass her by applauding when she gets here. That is the context for this discussion. This is the scene setter. And I think Pat has done a really nice job of framing, at least from an Alaska perspective, and also from a North American perspective, why we're here. But the scene setter is called the clean energy transition in the United States. And my perspective is that if you have a clean energy transition in the United States that comes through and is partnered with the state of Alaska, our colleagues in Canada, our colleagues in Greenland, at least to carve out that portion of what could be in the North and how that can fit not only just in a U.S. context, but actually in a global context and certainly with our friends and our allies. To diversify our portfolios, diversify our supply chains, strengthen our supply chains. So it sets the scene very well. Pat noted in the Alaska context the national imperatives. We came up with that title a year ago for the conference to try to draw the attention that those 2 words deliver, but also we do think that the United States, countries in North America, our friends and allies, global partners, that there is an imperative, and perhaps it's an international imperative. And that international imperative has a lot to do with the work that's going to be done today. I do now want to allow you the opportunity to applaud Dr. Emily Holland, who has traveled all the way to be with us today. She's the Assistant Professor, Strategic and Operational Research Department, U.S. Naval War College. Emily, you get the trophy for working hardest to get here. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. Glad I made it.
Yeah, we're glad you made it too. Pat noted a few things on the national imperative. Alaska in particular, but if you think about the Canada and Greenland and maybe other places in the north as well, there are boom and bust cycles a lot. We have to deal with that a lot. There's a lack of infrastructure. There's a lack of workforce. We can go through the list of challenges. But for our state, it has been jolted, sometimes good, sometimes bad, with these jolts in imperatives, whether it's a gold rush or World War II, which brought the state of Alaska incredible connectivity and infrastructure. If you build out your critical minerals, you might see some benefit in the state, in Canada, in Greenland, and elsewhere. Alaska has a tradition of leveraging these national imperatives. If you think about Alaska pre-oil pipeline and what it is today, you will see that that brought us from a territory to a state. And so these go beyond just getting critical minerals for our supply chains, which we need, for our products, which we need, but also there's a nexus here. And the nexus perhaps I'll ask our panelists also think about is this nexus between domestic policy and foreign policy in this Arctic context as well. So that'll be one key area. I won't go through all of the issues that my colleagues would cover aside from saying this. Finally, we've asked our colleagues here to give us their take on the current challenges the U.S. faces with regards to critical minerals access and secure supply chains. If nothing else, I think we have learned in the last 500 plus days, you cannot rely on a country or a region for any of the necessities that we need. They can be held hostage, you can run low on supply, it checks on supply chain connectivity on a number of issues. And so to diversify our portfolio, we have to think about those issues. Requirements for critical minerals to support clean energy transition as well as critical defense, communications, transportation, and other key factors. And finally, the activities of our competitors in this sector, their motivations, and perhaps what their long-term visions are. With that, let me begin by offering the floor to Duncan Wood. Duncan, you have several comments, but I would ask you also to make sure that you also touch on the Mosaic project, which I think can be foundational to these discussions we're going to have over the next couple of days. Duncan,
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mike, and many thanks to Pola for the invitation to participate today. Let me begin by just talking a little bit about the work that we've got ongoing here at the Wilson Center on Critical Minerals. I'm very proud to say that the Wilson Center has really been the leading think tank in Washington on this area, but in quite a different way. Rather than having one unified project, what we've got a number of different regional and thematic programs that are actually looking at critical minerals at the international level as well as the domestic level. The program which really began our work on critical minerals about a decade ago was the Environmental Change and Security Program, which has done extraordinary work in actually trying to look into how green critical minerals are and how we green the supply chain for critical minerals. It's been a very, very important part of their work. Our Latin America program has a wonderful project on the lithium triangle in South America, looking at the countries of Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, Peru, and looking at how they can play a bigger role in supplying lithium to global supply chains and what is needed to make that happen. My own Office of Strategy and New Initiatives a couple of years ago began work on supply chains and we published in October of 2021 a publication which Mike just mentioned, the Mosaic Approach, which is available on our website. And that was really an effort to sit down with stakeholders because part of the Biden administration's approach to supply chains in general and critical minerals specifically was to include stakeholder outreach. But in my experience, here in the United States and in many other countries, governments are terrible at stakeholder outreach. They use the language, they have a meeting, and they say, that's all done, we've ticked the box. So what we've done is we've created a critical minerals working group, which has now been ongoing for more than 2 years. And we continue to talk about these issues and to try to distill some of the learnings from those stakeholders and put them into our publications and our public-facing work. And lastly, it would be remiss of me to not to mention the Canada Institute here at the Wilson Center, which has also been doing some very important work on the bilateral approach to critical minerals between the United States and Canada. Now, pulling all of that together and putting it in the context of the shifts that we've seen over the past couple of years in supply chains in general, I think we can identify that there have been three main factors that have brought a more intensive focus on critical minerals. The first one is what I like to call the shift from value to values in our supply chain thinking. We used to think, well, listen, if it's dirty, if it's low value add, let's just make it where it's cheapest. You know, if we can save 5 cents on a widget, then let's put it, you know, across the other side of the Pacific Ocean, because that brings down the price for everybody. And all anybody cares about is lowest price. The lowest price is the law. In the past couple of decades, we've shifted from that to a focus less on just value for money, but more on values. Values such as ESG, values such as human rights, values such as environment, values such as corruption, transparency, etc. Values as well such as resilience of supply chains, values of national security and geopolitics. And that takes me to the next factor, which is that, of course, in the past couple of years, we have had a series of exogenous systemic shocks. COVID, of course, Ukraine being major shocks that have forced us to reevaluate how we think about supply chains, but most importantly, that it brought home the issue of supply chains to the average voter for the first time, I think, in the West for many, many, many years. So going into a supermarket and not being able to buy whatever you wanted was a huge psychological shock for many people. And that has justified more of a focus on the part of the administration, but also on the part of the legislature on the question of supply chains. And thirdly, I would say, of course, energy transition. An energy transition not just as a priority for the current administration here in the United States at the federal level, but for administrations at state and local levels throughout the country, and of course, increasingly for industry. And so we've seen industry, in particular the automotive industry, taking major decisions to shift away from fossil fuels into electric vehicle production by 2035. Some of our major automobile manufacturers saying they're going to go 100% electric by 2035. Those three factors coming together have actually moved our conversation, our narrative on critical minerals extraordinarily fast. You know, there's a lot of doom and gloom about critical minerals, that the Chinese dominate everything and it's going to be really difficult to adjust our supply chains, and all of that is true. But I'm one of the optimists on this because I see what has happened over the last 2 years, and it is nothing short of extraordinary. We've moved from a conversation where we said, oh, critical minerals, I think I've heard of those. Aren't those rare earths? And you say, well, actually, rare earths are sort of one subset of critical minerals, and then you begin to talk about all the other critical minerals. There's been a learning process, a learning curve, which has been very, very steep. But we've moved from that sort of, you know, ignorance about what critical minerals are, how they're produced, and what they do, to a very impressive series of governmental actions here in the United States and around the world. But not just government, industry as well. Industry not just taking the decision to go electric on electric vehicles, for example, but building out their own supply chains to make that happen. Dedicating, investing billions and billions of dollars, building gigafactories throughout the United States and throughout the world to make that happen. This has been an extraordinary mobilization of capital, expertise, human talent, etc. From the point of view of government, we've seen impressive moves on the diplomatic front. Mike asked us to talk a little bit about how we bring together the domestic and the international levels. Well, we've seen the creation of a mineral security partnership at the international level. I'm still waiting to see where the beef is in that, to be honest with you, because it's a very nice talking shop, but I'm waiting to see concrete results. But I do believe that it has real potential. And I think that the part of the biggest potential there is actually to expand the mineral security partnership to include some of the countries which we wouldn't normally consider. For example, why are the lithium triangle countries in South America not part of the mineral security partnership? Why did we not make that approach to them during the Summit of the Americas last year, when that was the obvious time to actually bring them on board? So I think there's still a lot more work to be done there. But perhaps most importantly is domestic legislation here in the United States. What we saw last year was nothing short of a seismic event, I would say. The Inflation Reduction Act, yes, it was a misnomer even then, and as a Brit, I cannot say IRA, but I will, you know. It's one of the weird things. Over here in the United States, people say IRA all the time. You go over to the UK and nobody will say that. They will say the Inflation RA. But the Inflation Reduction Act was truly a seismic event, basically committing upwards of $380 billion to this energy transition, to fighting climate change. And when I say upwards, of course, there's no cap on it. By some estimates, it could reach $1.2 trillion. Other people have said it's going to be about $800 billion. All depends on how many people take up those tax credits for buying electric vehicles and for doing other investments in the green economy. The incentives that are included in there are a very, very important part of the package, of course, and we've seen private investment begin to shift because of that. Here in the United States, we have seen enormous multi-billion-dollar investments in gigafactories, in mines, in processing and refining of critical minerals. We're seeing the build-out of the charging network. We're seeing impressive partnerships between what were previously rival companies, Ford, Tesla, GM, on the charging network, for example. All of this is coming together in a truly holistic, integrated way of looking at the supply chain. We've also seen from government, and included in the Inflation Reduction Act, the focus on FTA countries, or countries that can count as FTA countries, which is an important distinction. And so we've seen, of course, the initial shock and horror from the Japanese, the Koreans, the Europeans, the Brits, et cetera, in reaction to the Inflation Reduction Act, mostly because they said, how can you possibly, you, the United States, be engaging in industrial policy? And then that moment of saying, wait a second, we've been doing all this by using sticks and you're using carrots. That's an impressive change. Oh, maybe we need to do some of the same. And by the way, can we negotiate with you so that we can count as an FTA country? There has been an extraordinary, very, very quick shift from that, kind of like the 7 stages of grief. You know, they've gone from that real grief and then horror and anger to acceptance and negotiation and bargaining with the United States. And it's working. We're beginning to see the partnerships internationally that will make this possible. But of course, it's not enough. There's still a number of issues that remain in the way of getting the full implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act and solving our problems on critical minerals. Permitting, which is something which will be talked about a lot over the next couple of days, I'm sure. Infrastructure investments, human capital. Pat already mentioned the importance of workforce development and human and talent in the supply chain. What's next? Well, internationally, we need to build out those partnerships, not just with our FTA countries, but with the mineral source countries, making sure that we find a way to challenge and to rival what the Chinese have done so successfully over the past 20-odd years. We need to invest not just in the extraction of raw materials, of critical minerals in developing countries, but we need to think about investment in their infrastructure, in their human capital. We need to provide them with meaningful development finance. We need to think about it more as a partnership. We cannot go back to the old colonialist tropes of yesteryear. And that's what we hear repeatedly from the mineral-rich countries. Domestically, again, it's about partnerships. It's about the public-private partnership between industry and government. It's about partnership between federal, state, and local levels of government. It's about partnerships with indigenous peoples. It's about investing in the infrastructure that is needed to actually get the minerals to market. Human capital, there needs to be a partnership there with universities, with community colleges. We can't forget the vocational skills that are needed to make this happen. And on the energy front, we need to think a lot more about and be more creative on the decarbonization of the critical mineral supply chain. We can't just dig minerals out of the ground in a carbon-intensive way and then expect everybody just not to notice. This is ultimately about reducing our carbon footprint. It's about getting closer to net zero. It's actually about the carbon budget, and we're burning through the carbon budget really, really quickly. And so over the past year, I've had this conversation with myself in my home, sitting alone, many, many times. Should I buy an electric vehicle? Isn't it the right thing to do for the environment? I've got a car that I bought in 2015, which is an internal combustion vehicle. And I think, well, actually, if I buy a new vehicle right now, I'm actually going to be contributing to the problem, am I not? Because that includes a lot of emissions. What I need to do is I need to use my own vehicle less. I don't use it very much anyway. And then when it comes to the end of its life, then I'm going to buy an electric vehicle and very, very happily. So let's think about the smart ways in which we can do this. Let's think about the ways in which we can actually take decisions as consumers and as producers to actually reduce the carbon footprint overall. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Duncan. So many, I have like 12 different questions for you. But let me just pick one and leave the other 11 for later on. the human capacity and capital building, I'd like to just ask you a question on that. How does that work into not just the work that you're doing, but that is a critical component of this. And if this discussion is in a North American context, North American Arctic context, we have challenges in the north, right? Big neighborhood, small community. Our workforces, we have fewer people than other places around the world. How have other parts of the globe that are equally challenged to build the human capacity that is sustainable over time, educating, training local community members to work in this particular field, but also to stay where they are, right? That's a big theme with us in the North, is to build the North. So a couple of thoughts from you, please, on what you have seen other parts of the globe do and what has been successful.
So the first thing that I'll say is that the United States used to be a mining nation and it's no longer a mining nation. And so if you look around the country, and I think Pat mentioned this, there are very few geological engineering programs available around the country. And quite frankly, young people don't want to go into them because they don't see it as a sexy thing. They see it as a 19th century industry. The same problems were faced by the oil and gas industry more than a decade ago. And what they managed to do was to turn the narrative around by saying, listen, oil and gas is very much seen as being a 20th century industry. But the fact is that it involves enormous amounts of capital. It involves enormous amounts of technology. And the smart way to bring people in is to talk about how exciting this business is. And I think the same thing has to be true with mining and with geological engineering in general. And that's something where you can make a very a convincing case, I think, to a lot of young people, which is that look at the salaries that are involved here. The salaries are pretty good, I have to say. You know, if you are a mining engineer today, graduating from a program, the world is literally your oyster. And it's not just in the mining industry, it's in the consulting business, you know? And you can go off to work for a McKinsey or a Deloitte after a couple of years, and you can make a lot of money. Now, that's the problem that we face. How do you stop that brain drain from where we really need it into places where perhaps we don't need it so much? So the second thing I would say is this. So we need to build out the ecosystem of the mining sector again. And that's something which is gone. Now, Canada is far from being perfect in this regard, but I would say it's far ahead of the United States. Their mining and extractive industry ecosystem is much, much more diverse than the United States is, not only domestically but internationally. And you see that they've done a much better job in keeping that industry moving forward. You've got the big players and you've got the small players. We need to build that out and provide the right kind of incentives to do that, so that as a young person going into the industry, you see that your future is not just either with that same mining firm or leaping to a consulting firm, but that you can move through the industry in a meaningful way. And the third thing that I'd say is this, is that whilst, yes, we want to make sure that we have jobs for American citizens, I will go back to something that is dear to my heart because I'm an immigrant, which is that we need to fix a lot of the immigration challenges that we face in this country. There are mining engineers around the world who have enormous amounts of talent that we could bring in. Just look at our neighbors to the south in Mexico. They are graduating around 117,000 engineers, just engineers, a year, which is slightly more than half of what they graduate here in the United States. If we could bring those engineers here, because we don't just need mining engineers, we need engineers throughout the value chain for critical minerals, then we begin to see how we can actually make this a much more resilient and diverse human capital workforce development strategy. Because by bringing in that expertise from other countries, I actually think you add an enormous amount to the workforce here.
Yeah, thank you. We'll follow up on some of that over the next 2 days. Again, thinking about these comments, the challenge for all of us is to take what the intent of the conference is about, the themes that we will work through over the next 2 days, but also to take some of the themes that you're hearing here and have them influence and inform your discussions over the next couple of days. Now let's go to Emily. Emily, thank you for rushing over, getting here, rushing over, and coming up in real time. Scan out for us, right, the geopolitics of this issue. Duncan just talked about other parts of the world, but we're in a competitive world in a number of ways. Certainly Russia, China, United States, So scan out for us here for a moment and tell us some of the things that you think we should be keeping a particular eye on when it comes to this great power competition, perhaps great critical mineral competition, and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you all for having me. Excuse my tardiness. I was seated on the runway at National for about 45 minutes, just looking at my watch the entire time. But I am very glad I made it. That was a wonderful presentation to follow. And I'll start by just saying that I've spent much of the last 2 years working in Europe, where I think arguably you can say they've had the most seismic transition in terms of energy over the past years, obviously as a result of the pre-existing energy crisis and then Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so I spent a lot of time over there working with our allies, sort of working through different plans, looking at Repower EU, looking through how they might manage this transition, and spending a lot of time really digging into what is actually a completely seismic shift in not only European energy policy, but industrial policy, foreign policy, security policy, everything. So I think what I will begin with is sort of picking up on some of the threads that Duncan laid out, is that we've really moved from this era of basically unchecked globalization to one where states are now focused on strategic autonomy. Us as well, but also other states too. The European Union, China, Russia, Indonesia, all of these states that are now putting export controls on a lot of their products, right? So this is the era that we're in now. We've really moved to, I think, a new understanding of what it is to be a nation in this century. And so that's a really big shift in alignment. And one of the areas that I think is really important for us to think about is how that shift in alignment has sort of led to some issues between the U.S. and its allies and its adversaries as well. So in terms of Europe, which is where I spend the most of my time, there's actually been there's been significant issues with the U.S. And as you said, there was initial panic at the Inflation Reduction Act. I will spell it. There was initial panic by the Europeans, and now they've sort of come around, and I'll talk through some of what's happened. But there's still a lot that's left to be done in terms of working with our European allies to make sure that we're working together and not against each other. Because if you kind of go out and take a 20,000 look over the world, you'll see that if the West is going to meet the challenge, it needs to work together. There's no way to do it independently. And if the US and Europe are designing legislation that is in competition and not cooperation, it'll be a disaster. So we've already sort of seen these schisms happen, and we're going to talk through sort of some of the areas I think we can do better. So, of course, the Biden administration has been pushing for a variety of different aspects for greater production and sourcing. One of the key tools is, of course, the DPA, which is interesting, which is actually a Korean War era policy that was sort of designed to secure war materials. And today the administration is now employing it for the clean energy transition, which it has, I think, classified as an existential security priority. So they've also, of course, designed the IRA. And this is really interesting. It's a fantastic piece of legislation. It's huge, as Duncan said, but it does include some serious trade distortive subsidies, right, that the Europeans are not happy with, right? And so since the passage, actually, as you mentioned, a number of European companies have announced plan to create new clean energy manufacturing plants or expand them in the U.S., and that includes major European companies like Volkswagen, BMW, Enel, Freyr. So there's a lot of European investment that's coming this way because the subsidies are so attractive here. And on the European side, this is an issue, right? So their first reaction was an attempt to sort of protect European competitiveness vis-a-vis the U.S., but that's really the wrong approach, right? Instead, the EU should focus on sort of broader goals, such as overall competitiveness in the global market. As we know, the EU's share of GDP over the next 20 years is set to decline regardless of what happens. And so in the face of energy insecurity, they were really concerned that proportion would decrease more. And so the EU should focus on sort of boosting structural competitiveness writ large, and really formulating a trade policy response that includes reforms of the international subsidies regime, develops instruments for EU-level subsidies that focus on early-stage clean energy development, and also increasing EU resilience to trade disruptions. But the problem is that it hits the EU in a really politically sensitive area. How to reimagine its industrial policy, a rapidly changing workforce, and major structural economic issues resulting from the collapse of the EU-Russia energy trade. So we, of course, have felt the results of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but not in the same way that the Europeans have, and we will not, right? So Because prior to, let's say, February 2022, there were sort of three pillars that held up Europe. One was cheap energy imports to support European manufacturing. The second was exporting that manufactured goods to China. And the third was basically farming out security to the Americans, right? So all three of those legs on that stool have basically been knocked out of Europe. And that leads to a very, very politically sensitive situation in which governments are wanting to put forth more national policies that protect their national governments, right? Same way that I was talking about this more larger piece of strategic autonomy globally. European governments are really trying to do that now. And it's actually, we've been lucky in the sense that Putin is so toxic. We haven't seen much of the far right populists, but Europe right now is sort of sitting at a populist dream, right? A slow creeping recession, loss of manufacturing work base, all of these issues that make it very politically attractive for nationalist politics and policies. And that's a little bit of a concern for us when we want to have a more cooperative relationship with Europe than, say, competitive. So, of course, Europe has responded to the IRA. They proposed the European Green Deal industrial plan in February 2022. That provides, I think, $270 billion for green initiatives, accelerating permitting processes. Again, another really key process, especially in the EU, in which it takes an unbelievable amount of time to get anything done. Allow or hiring borrowing limits, greater flexibility for member states to invest in green technologies. These are all really, really great steps. And the EU hopes, just like we hope, that these measures will prevent firms from shifting to places like China or even the United States and help accelerate Europe's goal of becoming the first climate neutral continent by 2050. And they still have this goal of becoming the first climate neutral continent of 2050. But like most sort of union level issues, it's very difficult to achieve consensus in the EU. Some states like Italy want very quick responses to sort of protect them from the impending consequences of the IRA, whereas Germany and the Netherlands are less eager to invest in this. So that's a problem on the European side. But that's really some of the issues that I think is the main level one that the EU and the US should avoid, right? It's really imperative to both goals of Europe and here to increase ally shoring, right? To help bolster resilience against potentially hostile states. And even not hostile states. We're seeing a lot of, just general mineral exporting states closing down, export controls, right? A focus on nationalization. And that's really what we're seeing everywhere. We've seen China do this over the last several years, right? Just make a lot of effort into increasing the national control over the export and import of these resources. Of course, there's a lot of other new agreements going on. Last month, the EC adopted its negotiating directives for the critical mineral agreement, and hopefully this will help foster more cooperation between the EU and the US. There's a whole bunch of other issues too, and US and Japan have signed. So all of these partnerships are going to be really crucial moving forward because Russia and China, of course, have their own incentives in this. Russian investment and exploration actually declined pretty significantly this year, I think 30% in 2022, due to sanctions and other currency issues. And so the less they're exploring, the less of these minerals will come to market, right? So you have to think about the domestic politics of all of our adversaries as well as our allies. And I think all of these complicated pictures and interests are leading us to a place in which it is so important to focus on partnerships with allies. Of course, with the private sector, but from my political science perspective, just so important to focus on building relationships with allies that are cooperative and not in competition with each other. And I'll leave it there for more later. But
thank you, Emily. A lot to consider. My follow-up question to you is: you started out with a narrative, and then what captured me is your sentence about strategic autonomy, which I've heard a number of times in this context and in other contexts, not just with Europe, but this emerged issue of strategic autonomy. Yet the argument, if you can scan out, the argument is that in fact, even though that is of interest and perhaps self-assuring for a nation state, this autonomy to take care of its own, really what you're saying is that you need to do both. You need to figure out what it is domestically as a nation state. You also need to figure this out in a regional perspective. But you're arguing that there's no way for a state or even a region to not just secure these resources, but then to bring them to market for their own and for others. So there's this, seems like a tight wire walk going on between strategic autonomy and then also strategic integration or strategic cooperation. So my question here is, how are you seeing this tightrope being walked? Yes, bringing European countries and others to the U.S., there's incentives there, but going forward, this is not happening in a vacuum. So how do you see this balance or non-balance playing out?
That's a great question. I mean, I think for what's probably clear to everyone here is that for many years, we kind of lived in blissful ignorance about the reality of the scarcity of energy, food, minerals, right? And the last shocks of the last few years have sort of snapped us back to reality in the sense, wait a minute, there isn't just an endless abundance of this stuff that we can get at a moment's notice, right? And so that's where the strategic autonomy conversation has sort of popped up. The idea of, okay, we actually do have to protect our national interests, right? And make sure that we can get, enough, sunflower seed oil or natural gas or whatever, right? That's an important conversation at the political level and as a political narrative, right? But I think anybody that's actually working in this space and looks at the numbers projected of how much we were going to need for the clean energy transition, all of these things, knows that it's impossible, even for the United States, to do this alone. We need to distribute in terms of production, refining, exploration amongst our allies. That's really the only way to do it, especially given the advantage that China has and other states have in terms of how much they control the production and value chain in so many critical minerals already. So I think there's sort of there's a two-level conversation happening. One is there's this sort of political narrative that is like, yes, we need strategic autonomy to refocus on why these things are a national security priority. Because for years they were just kind of like, oh, that's soft stuff, right? We don't care about the energy or food or money. No, now we're realizing these are actually.
Well, we always cared about the money.
Yes, we cared about the money, but maybe not. But these are like, this is now actually understood to be a central component of national security. And that conversation about strategic autonomy, I think, is what encompasses it. But if we're actually looking at the reality of moving this forward in a way that is feasible, we understand that we need to work with our allies to do this.
Thank you. As Pat noted in the beginning of this discussion, a year ago we held a conference like this in Alaska. It's very focused on the state, and it's not just it's trying to identify its assets, but also how you develop these assets in a state that lacks infrastructure. How do you bring energy to parts of the state that does not have affordable even access to energy? Whole list of issues. But we knew that discussion was not happening in a vacuum. That issue is not a vacuumed issue. And so these two presentations, Duncan and Emily, I think have provided this context for Alaska and for the North American Arctic, for the Arctic writ large, so that we understand that when we're talking about a state or an Arctic region, that it is not siloed away. It's being impacted by all of these global dynamics that have been brought to us by our two colleagues here, and it's really dynamic. And some places in the North are situated fairly well to take advantage and to integrate quickly. Other places in the North are not situated in a place that we can take advantage of or they can take advantage of for their own state, province, region, but also for their own nation, and for the U.S., our own nation. So if we're arguing that Alaska or the North American Arctic is part of the way that we can address the needs for critical minerals, then we need to be thinking about the ripple effect down the road, but we also think about all these pressures coming from outside. It's like oil and gas. You can't just turn oil and gas development on and off depending on what you want. The market determines, and lots of things determine, and that's what we were hoping here today, is that these bigger issues of what determines, what are the impacts, what are the challenges, all gets teased out, and we're starting to hear these big global issues and how they funnel down to at least the state or to the Arctic as well. So with that, let me turn it over to Erin for her comments. And Erin, what I've tried to do here is kind of set you up with this funnel down to the state of Alaska, to the Arctic Energy Office, and your perspectives on this issue, but then how maybe all of these issues that were brought up work its way to the work that you do and your colleagues do in the state of Alaska. Please.
Great, thank you. There's a big sign here that says don't adjust mics, but I have this urge to move the mic over, so I'm just gonna hope that you all can hear me.
I had that same sign, but I didn't
okay.
follow orders, so.
All right, there we go. I just moved it. I'm Erin Whitney. I'm the director of the Arctic Energy Office at the Department of Energy. I came to this position in January of this year after nearly 20 years in the academic sector at the University of Alaska, as well as in the National Lab System at NREL. And it's been a thoroughly thrilling ride to join the federal ranks and to get under the hood, so to speak, to think about some of these issues and how to move the needle in my home state of Alaska. I was raised in Anchorage, and I'm currently located and based in Anchorage. The Arctic Energy Office plays a really unique role in the Department of Energy ecosystem. It was reauthorized by Secretary Perry in 2019 and has had a permanent interim director the last 2 years, and then I stepped in as the first permanent director in January. And it is the only regional office in the Department of Energy ecosystem. There's no other, office for a regional part of the United States, and its mission is to bring the Arctic to the Department of Energy and to bring the Department of Energy to the Arctic. And it is really, I think, the Department of Energy's way to reach this vast region, Alaska, which makes the United States an Arctic nation, to make sure, and this is what I'm taking to heart, to make sure that Alaska's and the Arctic interests are represented and have prominence at the Department of Energy, because it is such an important region in so many of our energy and global issues. The three pillars that we cover in our office, which makes me feel like I work for the Department of Everything instead of just the Department of Energy, are not only energy, but also security and science. So we cover a lot there. And Duncan, I was listening to what you said about stakeholder outreach, and I think that the Arctic Energy Office plays a really critical role in that by being this bridge between the federal government and the Department of Energy and our Arctic stakeholders. And that's a big part of what we do. We provide a front door for stakeholders within Alaska to access the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy is sort of this many-headed monster, as I've come to learn. And I carry the org chart around with me all the time. I can't expect you all to know what office should I go to talk to about all these things. And so we can become sort of a one-stop shop or a front door to help people navigate the different departments and the different offices within the larger Department of Energy and even the federal landscape overall, to figure out how to direct questions, how to direct concerns, how to direct priorities. And then similarly, we advocate for Alaska interests at the department. So, whether it's advocating for metrics for evaluating Alaska projects, making sure that Alaska is represented in reports and in overall analyses, making sure that Alaska data is accessible and usable by report writers and people who are making national policy. And just making sure that Alaska in general is not this sort of other, but is actually part of the whole United States in terms of generating energy policy and taking all of our national considerations. And I think it's important to remember, it's sort of stunning, but half of the nations, nearly half of the nation's federally recognized tribes are in Alaska. And so, there's quite a platform and a voice for our state to have in making sure that our indigenous concerns and priorities are heard. And I will also mention that, our office is a conduit to, the highest levels of the department. So we recently had the Deputy Secretary of Energy, David Turk, come to Alaska at the end of May, associated with the Sustainable Energy Conference. We have access to the Secretary of Energy herself, Granholm. And so this is a key part of that stakeholder outreach piece. And I know there's lots of other parts, but I thought that was an interesting point that you made, Duncan, and I wanted to highlight how our office plays that role. Within the Department of Energy, The Fossil Energy and Carbon Management Office, we call it the FECM because we love acronyms, factors prominently into this discussion and into activities around critical minerals. We also have a manufacturing office that takes sort of later stages, processing and refining as well. And we work very closely with FECM. And I was just looking at their strategic mission the other night as I was thinking about my remarks. And some of their priorities, I think, highlight real opportunities for Alaska. One of their priorities is to focus on, characterization of our critical minerals across the nation. Another is to focus on new and sustainable extraction technologies, so that we have, greener minerals, so to speak, as was mentioned earlier. And another area is in the processing and refining and alloying, where we've traditionally had, kind of a gap in activities. And I think these all represent opportunities for our state, not just to drive the energy transition. The energy transition is a big part of this, but to drive our overall technology support. I'm willing to bet that everyone in this room has a cell phone, which isn't necessarily about the energy transition. But if you look up all the critical minerals that are in your cell phone, I think it's like 20 or 25 of them, and we probably all have laptops. And these are just becoming modern pieces of life. And so, whether you're behind the energy transition or not, you're definitely a technology user. And we have to pull out these critical minerals, find out, how to process them, how to bring them to market. And we need to make sure we have a stable domestic supply of them. And Alaska, as I think has been said already, has all the critical minerals. We have just a wealth of resources. We probably have more than any other state, and we're ripe to be, I think, a key player and a key asset for the nation in this imperative that both Mike and President Pitney have mentioned. And I want to offer a couple perspectives here. I think in Alaska, as you listen to the news and some of the dialogue, it's easy to hear, mining versus fish, mining versus water, mining versus other animals and ecosystems. And what I would like to encourage us to think of, especially in light of how important these resources, all of these resources, but the critical minerals resources are to our daily lives and to the energy transition, is to think about mining and these other factors, not mining or mining but. Because I think that we have an opportunity here in Alaska for our communities and our indigenous groups to seize this chance to show and demonstrate to the rest of the world the value of our lands and resources, as well as responsible stewardship processes. I was thinking, actually, as we were flying here, we have this wild Alaskan salmon logo for Alaska. And, as an Alaskan myself, I pride myself on only trying to eat wild Alaskan salmon. That farm salmon is for people who don't know any better. Because it's something we're really proud of in our state. And I think if you're an Alaskan, you understand that, and hopefully it doesn't come off as snobbery. But what if we were to, have a push for sustainable Alaska minerals, right? And move toward, from value to values, right? I think that this could be something that could be very powerful, and we could market this as a strength of our state and a strength as our nation, and an asset that means something in our supply chain and in our use of these materials. The other 2 points I want to make are how we can use critical minerals in Alaska to bring along other sectors. It was mentioned, I think, by Mike and Duncan, the challenge of not only bringing in engineering talent, but keeping them in their places, keeping them in their regional homes. and not having people leave and have a brain drain. I think it's critical for us to think about mining and using our mining resources to drive our regional and local economies. When we look at how mines are tied to the development of other regions in the state, I think of Red Dog and Kotzebue, those are really powerful partnerships. And I think that, looking at mines as more than just extractive activities, but as economic drivers is really important. And taking that one step further and thinking about the additional economic activities that can be supported with that mining activity. So what are the corollary businesses and services and things that can be encouraged and facilitated to spring up to create that entire community that keeps people in the communities, not just the mining workers, but the entire community, because honestly, at the end of the day, that's what makes a community worth living in. So we need to think broadly about those economic opportunities. The other point I want to make about critical minerals in Alaska is how these opportunities can be a chance for us to think about utilizing new energy technologies. Many of our resources that we're thinking about for extraction in this arena are islanded, meaning they're not on any type of electric grid, as is much of the state. And mines take a lot of energy. And I think that these proposed mining operations provide great opportunities for thinking about new energy sources, demonstrating new energy sources, things like small modular nuclear reactors, maybe other types of sustainable and renewable energy resources as well. These are great test cases, and in a very closed and controlled environment. And I think approaching it like that also adds to the excitement of thinking about mining as a career, to be thinking about what the energy needs are and how to meet those for mining. So it's not just about pounding rocks and taking out minerals, but it's about thinking about new energy sources for our mines as well. So when we think about making mining careers more sexy, that gets me excited. And so I think that we can make strides in that way, thinking about, again, impacts that are bigger than just the mining operation itself. And so what I will leave you with as we enter these next 2 days of conversation is to help me understand, let me know, what more can the Department of Energy do to move the needle on some of these areas? Where are we doing well? Where are we not doing as well? And that extends to the rest of the federal government as well. The Arctic Energy Office is a conduit not only to the Department of Energy, but also to other federal agencies. We're lucky to have that regional office in Alaska. So I very much welcome your constructive feedback as to what more we can do to nudge the department into creating directions for Alaska that move the needle on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. As much as I want to follow up on your fish snobbery, I won't. We'll leave that for break. Can you explore with me a little bit this issue of new extraction technologies? Because I think it gets to a number of the issues that you spoke about. This is not an either-or kind of issue. You can't mining or extraction of, or that we're going to have to figure out this balance between development, sustainable development, and taking care of an environment into the future, wherever it is, not just in the Arctic, not just in Alaska, but wherever. Can you share with us a little bit about how technologies that, from your perspective, are growing and emerging and refining so that you can have perhaps is part of the solution set, that you can have mining for the national imperative, an international imperative, and you can live in an environment that is similar to what it is without the mining?
Thank you. And I will preface my comments by saying that I am not a mining engineer, and there are probably folks in this room that know much more about these technologies than I do. And so I would welcome their input as well. Thinking about extracting minerals from mining waste products that are already out there, I think is one option that can be, thought about instead of, making new messes, taking messes we've already made and extracting minerals, whether it's from coal ash or other types of byproducts that we already have out there. And I think that, there's no end to the creativity that we can employ when we think about mining processes. I mean, Alaskans are incredibly scrappy and creative and practical problem solvers. So whether it's, protecting water resources, there are lots of different, I think, approaches out there and potential for new approaches. And I think the sky is the limit, and I'm learning all about these new technologies myself.
Well, maybe explore. Maybe we can put a pin in that one and explore it during these next couple of days, because innovation and technology, innovations, new technologies, new ways of doing business are going to be the way globally that there's a balance between what we need, what we demand, and balancing with the environment that we all would like to have. We have a few minutes left. Let me ask each of our panelists to put them on the spot. I'm also chair of the Arctic Research Commission, so I have to ask each of you about a research question. So let me do that. Duncan, Emily, and Aaron, think about or share with us if you had one research question, one research problem you'd like a group to take on, what would that be? And it could be anything from physical sciences to the social sciences with regard to critical minerals.
Critical minerals or critical minerals in the Arctic?
Critical minerals.
Critical minerals. So I guess the research question that I would take on is the one of reducing emissions in the process of extraction and processing. And it's a big task, but I think it's one that actually makes a lot of sense, because ultimately, if you look at this in a holistic way, you can reduce your costs in a significant way by actually reducing your emissions. And I'll give you an example. We extract in one place, we move that ore to another place to refine, maybe it goes to another place to be further processed. If we can do more of this on the site of the mine or very, very close by, we're reducing our carbon emissions just from the transportation, okay? That's a big deal, a very, very big deal. You're also reducing your costs in moving it, okay? The second thing that I would say is this. If you can employ some of those technologies, energy technologies that Aaron was talking about, whether it's SMRs or whether it is, wind, solar, geothermal, whatever it is, whatever combination, then that's a way that you can reduce the carbon footprint of these critical minerals in a meaningful way. So if you can do all of these things together and you pull it all together in a cohesive package, then I think you actually begin to make money, you invest in the local community, you provide that kind of co-development structure that will make it make sense. And I think that just to add on one thing from the previous conversations about, how do we make this a more innovative process, just look at what's been happening in the oil and gas industry in recent years in terms of the question of methane emissions. Methane was seen as a byproduct that it didn't make any sense to capture it because, you can just flare it or just let it go off into the atmosphere. Of course, it's one of the most damaging climate gases that we have. So all of a sudden, we've come up with really, really cheap methods of capturing that methane and applying a price to it so it can be used for other purposes. That's the same kind of equation, I think, in mining, is that, all the tailings, the byproducts, et cetera, that Aaron was talking about. Put a price on it, provide the incentive structure, and I think that we can actually make enormous strides in making this a much greener industry than it is today.
Great, thank you. Emily, same challenge.
Well, sort of following that, this is a social science research question. Mining has very bad PR. And what we've seen is there is this obvious need to increase responsible mining in a variety of places, but if you tend to poll people about their thoughts on mining, they don't want it in their neighborhood, right? And so we've seen, particularly in Europe over the last decade at least, is just a host of projects just sitting there and stopping, despite the promise of economic development and jobs and all of these things, because people don't want it in their backyard. So for me, I would want to know what would we have to communicate to communities to get them to view mining as all of these things, greener, right? As going to build the community, as working towards a larger project. Because I think we don't have that sort of level of communication with the average public yet on why mining is so important, why it's different, right, than the mining of 30 years ago, right? And why it might be a benefit to bring to their communities, because we do need to expand it to a variety of new communities. And there still is, if you look at sort of general public opinion polling, quite a bit of hesitancy amongst people living there about wanting to welcome these projects into their community.
Good, thank you. Erin?
And as the Department of Energy representative, I'm going to focus on the energy needs of mines. I think I love the questions that both Duncan and Emily provided, but I also think another key question is, I would challenge, potential mining and even current mining operations to consider, how they might use new energy sources, greener energy sources. Again, whether that's SMRs, whether it's fossil fuel sources combined with carbon capture. There are a lot of incentives and programs to do that. And along with that question, how are the programs that the Department of Energy and the federal government, encouraging that or not encouraging it enough? Because I think mines can be absolute leaders in this field, and I would like to be able to help them become that.
Great, thank you. We've come to our time. Please thank our colleagues here for starting off the morning. Duncan, Emily, and Erin, thank you so very much. I'll turn it back over to the organizers.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to Erin, Emily, and Duncan for your insightful comments to contextualize today's discussions. I'm Jack Durkee, Senior Associate with the Wilson Center's Poll Institute, and I'm excited to see you all here today for this conference. I want to echo Becca's and Pat's sentiments that your expertise and your participation will propel our efforts here to achieve the goal of actually advancing nuanced policy for mineral development. I'm here now to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. David Applegate. Dr. Applegate is the director of the U.S. Geological Survey, and in this role, he oversees the scientific and operational programs of the Bureau. He has served at USGS in a variety of roles since 2004, including recently as Associate Director for Natural Hazards since 2011, leading USGS emergency response activities. Dr. Applegate is a Fellow of the American Association for Advancement of Science and the Geological Society of America, and is a past president of the Geological Society of Washington, and he has a BS in geology from Yale and a PhD in geology from MIT. He spoke at last August's inaugural Minerals Conference in Fairbanks, and we are honored to host him here again today. Dr. Applegate, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And yes, as you heard this background working on natural hazards, so when I heard about the seismic shift and the seismic transition, I was feeling right at home on this topic. So no, that was a tremendous panel. Did a great job of getting us started on this important topic. So thank you, Jack, for your introduction. It's great to be here with you today at the Wilson Center. As was noted, it was a real privilege for me to be part of the inaugural conference that took place in Fairbanks last August, and I'm very glad to see this dialogue continuing to expand, and very much want to thank President Pitney and Mike Sifrega for their leadership in this on this issue. The USGS plays a number of roles in studying global mineral supply chains and looking at challenges, providing data and analyses that inform policy decisions. We heard quite a bit in the last panel about the role of the Inflation Reduction Act. For us, it's really the bipartisan infrastructure law that has greatly accelerated our collaborations with state geological surveys in Alaska and around the nation on foundational geoscience data collection and analysis related to critical minerals in support of clean energy supply chains. So this is a very exciting time. We have a tremendous amount of new data, new information to be able to see put to work in this on this issue. So the USGS, we're the science arm of the Department of the Interior, and we have no regulatory responsibility, no land management responsibility, so we're a little bit different entity within the department. But what we do is we bring our science to bear in support of the decision making on all of those regulatory and land management decisions that have to happen over a wide range of environmental, resource, and public safety issues. As an objective and impartial science bureau, the USGS has a responsibility to ensure that our research and data collection that we undertake and the resulting information that we deliver are useful as a public good for all. Our mission and vision statements are targeted towards delivering our science to decision makers in the most effective manner we can. And to that I would add to make sure that it's reaching those who need it the most, in particular a goal to be able to reach the underserved communities across the nation, and certainly that's one of the big challenges in Alaska. All our mission areas are focused on delivering science that matters, what we call actionable information, and that's very much the case for our work in energy and minerals. So by statute, we provide the nation's data on global supply, demand, and trade of mineral commodities. We map and quantify the nation's mineral resource base and evaluate the impacts of mineral resource development on both supply chains and the environment. And we also evaluate the potential to reuse mine waste as a resource. So we describe this approach as studying the full cycle of geologic resources. Now, the Energy Act of 2020 defines a critical mineral as a non-fuel mineral or mineral material essential to the economic or national security of the U.S., and which has a supply chain vulnerable to disruption. So really, it's two pieces to that. Critical minerals are also characterized as serving an essential function in the manufacturing of a product, the absence of which would have significant consequences for the economy or national security. Now, under the Energy Act, the USGS leads the whole of federal government effort to develop and maintain the nation's list of critical minerals. The current list identifies 50 mineral commodities with significant potential for supply disruption, dependence on imports, and major economic sectors' dependence on those minerals. By law, the list is updated every 3 years, and that means that the federal minerals community is already at work developing approaches to refine the methodology and the data collection for the next list. And in this effort, we're very fortunate to, along with the Department of Energy, to co-lead the National Science and Technology Council's Critical Minerals Subcommittee, which is a key tool, along with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, to bring together the interagency community on this key issue. Now, a number of mineral commodities are popularly associated with specific applications. For example, there's a lot of press on energy critical minerals, but it's important to keep in mind that our analysis shows that these minerals are typically required by multiple manufacturing and economic sectors, such as batteries and infrastructure or aerospace. In fact, the highest volume uses of energy critical minerals may not be in the energy sector at all. For example, gallium is highlighted here near the top left as an important component of thin film solar photovoltaic systems. Gallium is also currently in the news for its importance in semiconductor chip manufacturing. And as a more general example of competing mineral needs across sectors, the U.S. has reached a crucial period for infrastructure rebuilding and modernization. And the developing world is building a great deal of new infrastructure as well. In the bigger picture, damages from natural disasters are increasing worldwide, which increases the need to rebuild infrastructure. So demand is increasing in many countries for many commodities. Our data show that part of what makes minerals critical is competition across economic sectors as well as between nations. Now, what this slide shows is the dependencies of whole assembled technologies on specific minerals, highlighting solar photovoltaics, wind turbines, electric vehicle batteries, and hard infrastructure. Now, on this next slide, we break down the supply chains for specific components of those technologies. The USGS has over 100 years of data on mineral commodities in the global economy. And what I'm showing here is sort of a slice through that data set. On the left-hand side are a dozen mineral commodities that are needed for energy applications. The colors show each mineral supply's risk over an 11-year period, and the warmer the color, the greater the risks to the supply chain. Second from right, we show the primary country producing each mineral, and then listed at the far right are the other major uses of that material, in addition to energy. Now, the second row's warming colors show that the supply of cobalt is increasingly at risk. Much of the world's cobalt production is in the Congo, and much of the refining is in China. Cobalt is important to a number of domestic industries. Just within the energy space, cobalt is used in both lithium-ion batteries as well as gas turbines. It's also used in aerospace and in areas of manufacturing that require cutting and other hard-wearing equipment. So domestic industries are increasingly competing with each other and increasingly dependent on the same concentrated cobalt supply. A key message here is that part of what makes these minerals critical is competition across economic sectors as well as between nations. And a further takeaway is that even when looking only at trade relationships, each mineral commodity has its own specific futures and supply chain issues. There's no one-size-fits-all solution for all supply chains. Because of these many needs for mineral commodities, the U.S. federal community is evaluating a range of approaches to reduce supply chain risks, including sustainable primary production from domestic mines and reliable trade partners, secondary production from recycling and remining wastes, and new technologies that substitute alternate materials for critical minerals. The USGS monitors development in all of these areas in our work on supply chains. We seek to improve the nation's understanding of domestic mineral resource potential and mine waste as a resource, and interactions between resources such as mine waste and water quality. And when our data highlight potential issues and solutions, we share our analysis with the agencies that make domestic supply chain investments and develop foreign trade strategies. Under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the federal minerals community coordinates through the National Science and Technology Council. Through that body, our work directly informs decisions by the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, the Department of Commerce, the Export-Import Bank, and other agencies that manage national stockpiles and invest in mineral processing and manufacturing and permit remining and reclamation of legacy mine waste. Now, this is the context in which we consider Arctic mineral resources. Long-standing international science partnerships have developed general maps and studies of mineral resources in the Arctic region, and it's widely recognized that the region has many major mineral deposits, including deposits hosting critical minerals. Accessing and developing Arctic deposits is more difficult than in other parts of the world. Despite the region's relative inaccessibility and harsh environment, recent decades have seen increased exploration and development in the Arctic, a trend that may accelerate with the increasing demand for critical minerals. Now, for the North American Arctic, USGS has forged a strong partnership with Canada through both bilateral engagement as well as trilateral. We have the Critical Minerals Mapping Initiative with the Geological Survey of Canada and with Geoscience Australia. And this is focus for these three nations is to focus on what we call continental scale perspectives on critical mineral resources, starting with the recently published maps of lead-zinc deposits potential for North America and Australia. Now, Canada ranks in the top 10 countries for the production of potash, potash, diamonds, uranium, aluminum, cobalt, gold, nickel, and iron ore. Arctic Canada is a vast, underexplored area. Greenland has substantial known mineral resources and high potential for hosting additional undiscovered resources. And Scandinavian countries have scientific and technical expertise, and their mineral resources are well studied. Russia has a significant minerals industry and produces several critical mineral commodities. In 2022, Russia was the leading producer of palladium, producing 42% of the world's supply. And what's reflected on this chart, this is simplified from a map that was developed by the Geological Survey of Norway, and groups the metals into 5 categories. Base metals, that's aluminum, cobalt, copper, nickel, lead, and zinc. Precious metals, gold, silver, and the platinum group elements. Special metals, beryllium, lithium, this is where the rare earth elements fall in, molybdenum, niobium. I was at this point, feel like I'm going to start singing the Elements song by Tom Lehrer. The temptation is always there. As well as then ferrous minerals with chromium, iron, manganese, titanium, and vanadium, and then, of course, diamonds. Now, Alaska already plays a key role in meeting the nation's need for critical minerals. For example, the Red Dog mine producing 4% of the world's zinc, a commodity that is on the latest list of critical minerals. That mine is also North America's largest producer of germanium, another critical mineral which has been in the news lately for its role in advanced technology applications. And I should also note that in addition to these major onshore mineral focus areas, the USGS also put out a report in 2022 looking at Alaska's coastal and deep ocean mineral resources. And other than some nearshore placer deposits that have been mined for decades, data on those resources is quite limited. Now, existing maps of Alaska and the broader Arctic region are really not sufficient to support detailed planning and evaluation of the potential and trade-offs of additional mineral development in the region. In fact, the U.S. as a whole is undermapped relative to other developed nations. So in 2019, we launched a federal-state partnership called the Earth Mapping Resources Initiative, or Earth MRI. Together, the USGS and the state geological surveys are collaborating to identify areas of the U.S. with potential mineral resources. And in 2021, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law funds greatly accelerated and expanded our mapping of domestic critical mineral resources, expanding the focus not only to include the in-ground resources, but also to include mine waste. And as reflected here, when we talk about foundational data collection, that includes high-resolution elevation, geologic mapping, and a wide range of geophysical and geochemical data collections. This new data is directly informing our understanding of Alaska's mineral resources. These data are also crucial to inform a broad range of other earth science-informed issues that are also undermapped and understudied in the Arctic region, including energy and water resources, natural hazards, and infrastructure planning. Now, we heard a lot in the last session about human capital and the workforce, and I'll say one of the reasons we're sort of most excited about these investments taking place through Earth MRI is that it's going to support a new generation of geologic mappers and economic geologists, 2 fields where we really have a critical shortfall in terms of that expertise that is going to be absolutely essential for the analysis and ultimately responsible development of these resources. Now, our single largest investment in Earth MRI funding is in Alaska. And this builds on a long partnership that we've had with the Alaska Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys. Work by the USGS and the Alaska DGGS with Earth MRI data has revealed new geologic and mineral resource features in eastern Alaska, and critical mineral mapping and research will extend into all of the major mineral belts in Alaska over the next 5 years. Now, here I'm delighted to show you one of the earliest products of the Earth MRI collaboration. Working with the state geological surveys, we've identified areas of the U.S. with geologic potential to host critical minerals. So, for example, the Basin Brine Path mineral system, which is shown here in light blue, includes zinc and germanium deposits, which you can see in the Brooks Range in northern Alaska, and that's what underlies the Red Dog mine, back to that earlier example. Now, to preview some of the implications of this effort, this map highlights only those mineral systems that have the potential to produce minerals essential for advanced battery manufacturing. We're working to collect data and update these maps to quantify how much of these minerals may be present, not only where they may be present. But even before we reach that point, I think this offers a tantalizing glimpse of the potential economic implications of this type of mapping effort. And we're developing similar maps of potential for a number of additional technologies. Now, Alaska is so big, we didn't want to just make it, put it in the corner again. So here's that same set of maps for potential for battery minerals looking at Alaska. Again, up on the top left, still in light blue, is the Basin Brine Path Mineral System. And then there are 5 other mineral systems that are shown here with the potential to host battery minerals. And again, emphasizing when we're talking about mineral systems here, this isn't about a single mineral resource, single mineral commodity, but these are the settings in which, of course, we see many of some of the most critical minerals are often not even the primary focus for exploration. Now, I noted earlier that we're building on these maps with research and assessments that quantify mineral resources across the U.S. And in fact, the USGS is focusing a series of resource assessments on critical minerals needed for the energy sector, ranging from electric vehicle batteries to grid energy storage applications. These minerals include graphite, lithium, cobalt, nickel, vanadium, and manganese. Now, graphite was first on my list, and these maps are a portion of our newly published assessment of graphite in Alaska. Alaska has the largest known flake graphite resources in the U.S. The series of maps focusing on critical minerals is really focused on critical minerals still in the ground. But USGS work on critical minerals in Alaska includes evaluating the potential for both mineral recovery and reclamation at legacy mining sites. As we've done for mineral resources yet to be discovered and mined, we're pooling our federal and state knowledge of mineral resource potential in mine wastes. That will give us a much better sense of the total domestic resource, both above and below ground, and the prospects for increasing reprocessing and advanced recycling. And I'll add, this is also really, this additional focus on mine waste has really greatly expanded the range of states in which we're now seeing interest and engagement. I think we have 41 of the different states' surveys involved because of that expansion. Now you're going to feel like you're back in chemistry. So if chemistry wasn't a good experience, I'll just apologize right now. But so here are, ladies and gentlemen, the elements. Mine waste reprocessing may be an especially effective strategy for commodities that are primarily byproducts of developing other minerals. And many of these byproduct minerals are required for manufacturing advanced technologies. Now, on the periodic table, we have here in the orange and red colors, these are the minerals for which at least 50% of the production is as byproducts of other minerals. So we're collaborating with the state geological surveys to develop standard methods by which we can characterize the potential to use mine waste as a resource. And we're collaborating with federal land management agencies on demonstrations of mine waste reprocessing as part of reclaiming former mine sites. In Alaska, historically, placer mining has recovered precious metals from stream beds, but left behind both environmental damage as well as critical minerals. In addition to studying the remaining minerals, we're also collaborating under the Arctic Executive Steering Committee's leadership to understand the impacts of legacy mining and provide decision support to help ensure a sustainable future for mining. We see our emphasis on understanding the total resources, that is, still in the ground and in mine waste, is both pragmatic and part of a necessary emphasis on sustainability questions. We're providing advice on strengthening mineral supply chains through all of the above strategies that use primary production where it's necessary and can be performed as sustainably as possible, secondary production through recycling and reprocessing waste where feasible, and strategic trade alliances. These days, we're typically asked not only where there are resources, but what may be the trade-offs and the consequences of developing those resources or of trading for those resources. Now, for this, sort of closing up here, I've chosen a map of circumarctic permafrost to accompany this slide here. The world's economy, energy systems, and emerging technologies depend heavily on minerals, and Alaska and the Arctic present both opportunities and challenges in this respect. There is potential for economic development of mineral resources in these regions, and at the same time, the interests of indigenous communities, the fragile Arctic environment and infrastructure, and the rapidity of climate change in the Arctic pose unique and daunting challenges to development. In 2022, the Department of the Interior published 11 fundamental principles for domestic mining reform. Those principles include the need to assure that a reliable and sustainable supply of critical minerals can be provided through both environmentally and socially responsible mining, as well as through recycling and other sustainable sources, including the issue of mine waste that I was just speaking about. This need is especially acute in Alaska as a frontier region for critical mineral resource development. For us, identifying a path forward that meets this challenge starts with collaborative mapping and research. And what we've said to the Arctic Executive Steering Committee is that we believe that it is essential to better understand the opportunities and the challenges of sustainable mining and remining in Alaska's subsurface and its mine waste. We see our task as a science agency as informing hard decisions, and we see in these collaborations an opportunity to incorporate our science and Interior's principles in a working model for sustainable mining. So in closing here, let me just thank you again for the opportunity to participate today. Back in 1917, the USGS, founded in 1879, noted that the graphite deposits of Seward Peninsula have long been known, but a number of factors have hitherto prevented their exploitation and development. So 100 years later, some of the challenges associated with critical minerals in Alaska and the Arctic remain the same, and some are very new. We still have a long way to go, but with the new funding support and the strong federal, state, tribal, and community partnerships, we are making great strides in addressing both our critical mineral challenges and key earth science issues. So thank you again for the opportunity to be part of this workshop. All right, and I don't know, have time for a couple of questions? Or?
I don't know if they've got the microphone set up.
Okay. Yeah, I've got one back.
Yeah, Doctor, just curious, there's been a lot of talk about what are critical metals, but it's always surprised me that copper is not considered a critical metal. Can you maybe outline for the audience why that is, since none of the other metals work without it in terms of the green energy transition?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. The question is about copper and about the critical minerals list. And this is, as I mentioned at the outset, the critical minerals list is sort of at some level a term of art, right? It's very specifically defined under the Energy Act, and it's both about the resource itself, but it's also about that specific issue of potential for supply chain disruption. And so it's those two factors that end up on that list. And so there are many essential minerals, and copper absolutely is an example of that. That nevertheless is not included in the critical minerals list. In this case, that really reflects a couple of different factors with respect to the supply chains, both the degree of domestic production and the variety of sources there, the percentage of the use that comes from recycling. And then finally, we do have reliance on non-U.S. sources, but the ones that we rely on the most are from longstanding partners with which we have free trade agreements. And so those are all some of the factors that go into it. But I do really want to emphasize when we talk about the critical minerals list, that there are many other very important foundational minerals that are not reflected on that. And when we look at the USGS work and our focus, we very much include that. And indeed, as I mentioned, a lot of the focus is on these mineral systems And so copper, for example, is a big focus of both our work, our research, as well as our assessments. So no, thank you for that question. Over there.
Hi, thank you for that talk. You had mentioned a trilateral agreement between the U.S., Canada, and UK and Australia. I was wondering if you could speak to any other international partnerships or outreach that you can speak to.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. No, and indeed, we work with, particularly the nature of, as a geological survey, we work with a number of the other geological surveys. I just had the opportunity last year to participate in the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Euro Geosurveys, the sort of the compendium of surveys across the EU. We have long-standing collaborations there, as well as with the British Geological Survey. I've also been heartened just to see how the USGS sort of research and methodologies is being applied. At that Euro Geosurveys meeting, I was actually on a panel with a representative from the Ukrainian Geological Survey. And of course, the focus of her remarks, she at the time was a refugee in Switzerland and was able to come to this meeting. Her focus was, of course, on after the conflict, being able to increase development in the nation, and citing, their whole goal was making the data as accessible as possible, make it easy as possible for people to engage and become involved, and using some of the methodologies developed by the USGS. And again, I'll just emphasize that's really one of the hallmarks for our work is making this data as widely accessible and in a form that's going to be most useful, so that it can provide this sort of foundational basis upon which not the decision making can be done, and as well as for the more detailed studies that are inevitably would be needed for the development of resources. So thank you for that.
Yes, I'd just like to amplify that last question. Specifically, has there been much cooperation or projected cooperation with the Danish geologic surveys? Because in many of these maps that I've been taking a look at, Greenland is kind of an empty quarter there, and I suspect that's probably lack of knowledge rather than actual lack of resources. And I wonder whether or not there's been any concerted effort to map out and do an MRI of large parts of Greenland.
No, thanks for that question. And I know that the Danish survey was part of this engagement with the Europeans, but I don't know specifically in terms of the work in Greenland. I don't know if you're aware of. Yeah, no, I'll have to get back to you on that, because I know there has been collaboration, but I don't know the specifics of it. Is there another? Oh, down here. Waiting for the mic.
Hi, I'm John Farrell from the Arctic Research Commission. When you assess the criticality of the supply chain, I imagine that requires expertise beyond just geology and geophysics. It requires somebody who understands geopolitical, geostrategic issues. So where does the survey find that expertise, and who conducts that element of the analysis?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. And so, we're the survey is very fortunate to include our National Minerals Information Center is really an amazing asset, and it does have some geologists, but it has a lot of folks with economics and a whole range of other social science and other statistical backgrounds and so forth, as well as then, and part of their job is to really build the relationships so that externally. So that they are attuned to this, because as noted, this work is which the USGS inherited from the former U.S. Bureau of Mines back in the mid-90s. this incredibly important work is as much about the sort of the human aspects of this, right, as it is about the resource itself. So the expertise goes well beyond geology, and again, part of that is that these analysts are really building that long-term knowledge in not just the specific elements, but as well as in specific regions. So, yeah, thank you for that. Sorry.
Follow-up question about, especially because you brought up the National Mineral Information Center. I was curious if there were any efforts or initiatives to include more products out of the MIC. Obviously, the mineral commodity summaries and yearbooks are fantastic sources of information, but are particularly limited with respect to the issue of critical minerals, oftentimes needing to redact information because of confidentiality concerns for domestic producers, which can be challenging for researchers like myself who are trying to understand these markets. I'm just curious about the survey's thoughts on maybe creating more publicly available information, particularly with respect to the economics here.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, and yeah, would love to explore that. I mean, I think we're always looking at how do we package this information in ways that's going to be most useful. I mean, there always are the issues of confidentiality in terms of some of the private sector sources. But one of the areas, for example, we're increasingly trying to look at is not just looking at this on sort of a mineral by mineral standpoint, but really trying to look at from a multi-resource aspect. And particularly also expanding out to not just thinking about it in the context of the minerals themselves, but again, as I mentioned, it's also understanding things like what are the implications with respect to some of the other parts of what the USGS does, so water resource implications, ecosystem impact implications, and to be able to do a better job of really bringing together some of the information that we have in this arena. So.
Hi, Manuel Carmona from the European Union delegation to the US here in DC. One of the priorities of the European Union, of course, is try to use more the resources that we have already in the economy. So recycling and the circular economy is crucial also for critical minerals. We're signing today or tomorrow, actually, we're signing a battery regulation that will look at, for example, critical minerals in those batteries and how can we reuse them as much as possible. But I wanted to refer to something that you mentioned during your very interesting presentation. It was about possible synergies between the recovery of critical minerals from legacy mines and the remediation. Could you expand on that? Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in many respects, this is the classic looking for the win-win solution here, right? In other words, there's one of the great challenges that we have with the extensive mining legacy is to have the financial support to be able to do remediation. There's significant costs associated with that, and so the potential for being able to, and so our focus now is on again working with the state surveys. Can we really find out where are the priority areas where we have this opportunity for the win-win, and I mentioned this range of data collection going on. One of the really important data collections that just happened, this is down in the sort of southwestern U.S., is actually a partnership with NASA looking at multispectral geophysical data collection. Again, to be able to now hone in on which of those, of the many legacy mining sites, which are the ones that have the greatest prospective opportunity. So I think that's at the heart of it. Really is to try to get at the proverbial win-win. So thank you. Okay, we're good. All right. Thank you so much.